From the moment you become aware of yourself, you begin telling a story about who you are, and most of the time you do not realize you are the author. This story feels invisible because it does not sound like a narrative. It sounds like truth. It shows up as quiet assumptions, automatic reactions, and inner explanations for why things happen to you. You tell yourself who you are good at being, what you deserve, and what kind of future is realistic for someone like you. These beliefs feel natural, but they are constructions, not facts. They form the lens through which every experience is interpreted. Over time, this lens hardens into what psychologists and philosophers call a personal myth. And once it exists, it begins shaping reality in ways that feel strangely inevitable. A personal myth is not a lie you consciously tell yourself, but a framework you unconsciously live inside. It explains why you succeed, why you fail, and why certain patterns keep repeating. If something good happens, the myth interprets it in a way that keeps itself intact. If something bad happens, the myth uses it as proof that it was right all along. This is why two people can live through the same event and come away with completely different meanings. One sees confirmation of growth, the other sees confirmation of limitation. The event itself is neutral, but the myth decides what it means. Over time, meaning becomes destiny. This is how inner narratives quietly turn into lived realities. Most personal myths begin early, long before you had the language to question them. A comment from a parent, a comparison at school, a moment of embarrassment, or a single failure can plant the seed. The mind, trying to protect itself, builds a story to make sense of the experience. It might decide that love must be earned, that visibility is dangerous, or that effort never pays off. Once formed, the myth becomes efficient. It saves energy by predicting outcomes before they happen. But what feels like wisdom is often just repetition. The myth becomes the unseen architect of your expectations. As you grow older, culture adds layers to these stories. Society hands you roles, definitions of success, and ideas about worth. You absorb messages about who gets chosen, who gets heard, and who gets left behind. These messages merge with your early experiences and reinforce your personal myth. If the myth says you are an outsider, you notice rejection more than acceptance. If the myth says you must be perfect to be loved, mistakes feel catastrophic. You are not seeing reality as it is, but as your myth allows it to be seen. And because perception guides action, the myth begins to shape your choices. One of the most powerful personal myths is the hero narrative. In this story, life is a battle, and you must constantly prove yourself. You push harder, sacrifice more, and measure your worth by achievement. On the surface, this can look like motivation and ambition, but underneath, it often hides fear of rest, vulnerability, or being ordinary. The hero myth keeps you moving, but never arriving. It promises fulfillment later, once you earn it. Reality bends to this myth by giving you endless challenges, but very little peace. Another common myth is the victim narrative, where life is something that happens to you rather than something you participate in. In this story, circumstances, people, or systems are always the deciding force. While this myth can begin as a response to real harm, it can quietly turn into a prison. You stop noticing opportunities because they do not fit the story. Responsibility feels threatening because it challenges the narrative. The myth protects you from disappointment by lowering expectations, but it also limits growth. Reality reflects this by offering fewer chances because you are not reaching for them. There is also the outsider myth, where you believe you never quite belong. You may feel different, misunderstood, or out of place no matter where you are. This story can make you observant and introspective, but it can also keep you distant. You might hold back parts of yourself, expecting rejection before it happens. When connection feels shallow, the myth says, "This is proof." But the truth is that distance often creates the very isolation it fears. The myth shapes reality by keeping you half present. What makes personal myths so powerful is that they operate below conscious awareness. You rarely say them out loud. Instead, they show up as gut feelings and immediate conclusions. You feel unqualified before you apply. You assume rejection before you ask. You interpret silence as disapproval. These reactions feel instantaneous, but they are rehearsed. They come from a story that has been running for years, and because the reactions are fast, they feel trustworthy. The brain loves coherence more than truth. It would rather have a consistent story than an accurate one. Personal myths provide that consistency by filtering out information that contradicts them. When something challenges the story, the mind explains it away. When something supports it, the mind highlights it. Over time, this selective attention creates a feedback loop. The myth looks increasingly accurate because it only sees what confirms it. This is how a belief becomes a worldview. Your personal myth also shapes how you interpret other people. You assign motives, intentions, and meanings based on your story. A neutral comment becomes criticism. A delay becomes rejection. A success becomes luck instead of competence. These interpretations affect how you respond, which then affects how others respond to you. Slowly, relationships begin to align with the myth. What feels like fate is often narrative reinforcement. Even your sense of identity is influenced by these unseen stories. You describe yourself using labels that feel factual, but are actually narrative choices. You say you are shy, bad at commitment, unlucky, or not creative. These statements are not observations. They are conclusions drawn from past moments. Once spoken internally, they become boundaries. You stop experimenting outside the role. The myth becomes self-fulfilling. Reality does not push back strongly against these stories. It is flexible enough to accommodate many interpretations. This is why two people with different myths can live in what feels like completely different worlds. One experiences abundance, the other scarcity, even with similar resources. One sees possibilities, the other sees risks. The difference is not intelligence or effort, but narrative structure. The story decides what feels possible. The danger of personal myths is not that they are entirely false, but that they are incomplete. They freeze a few moments in time and use them to explain an entire life. They ignore growth, context, and change. A mistake becomes an identity. A phase becomes a destiny. The myth simplifies reality, but life is more complex than any single story. Many people never question their personal myth because it feels like common sense. Questioning it feels like losing footing. If the story is wrong, then what is true? This uncertainty can feel uncomfortable, even frightening, but it is also the beginning of freedom. Awareness loosens the grip of the narrative. Once seen, the myth is no longer invisible. Rewriting a personal myth does not mean replacing it with blind positivity. It means holding the story lightly instead of letting it hold you. It means noticing when a reaction comes from the past rather than the present. It means asking whether a conclusion is a fact or a habit. This process requires patience, not force. Myths dissolve through curiosity, not attack. Small moments of awareness create cracks in the narrative. You pause before reacting. You consider an alternative explanation. You act differently once, even if it feels uncomfortable. These moments may feel insignificant, but they interrupt the feedback loop. Reality responds to new actions with new outcomes. The story begins to shift. Over time, a new narrative emerges, one that is more flexible and compassionate. It does not deny past experiences, but it no longer lets them dictate the future. This new story allows room for change. It acknowledges uncertainty without turning it into threat. It sees identity as something alive, not fixed. When you change your personal myth, reality does not magically transform overnight, but your relationship to it does. You notice opportunities you once ignored. You respond instead of react. You take responsibility without self-blame. The world begins to feel less hostile and more responsive. This is not because the world changed, but because the lens did. Understanding personal myths reveals how much of life is co-created. You are not a passive character in a predetermined script. You are an ongoing narrator, even when you forget it. Every interpretation is a choice, even if it does not feel like one. Every story can be revised, expanded, or softened. The unseen architects of your reality are not external forces alone. They are the stories you carry, repeat, and protect. Once you see them, you gain the power to question them. And once questioned, they lose their absolute authority. Reality becomes less rigid and more open. This is not about inventing a perfect story. It is about realizing that no single narrative can fully contain who you are. You are always more than the myth you inherited or constructed. Growth begins when the story becomes a tool rather than a cage, and from that space, a different kind of life becomes possible.